When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
Hi everyone, I'm Deb Flashenberg. Welcome to Yoga, Birth, Babies, a podcast produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. We will be diving into everything prenatal yoga, birth, and baby related, hoping to inspire, educate, and empower you through your journey into motherhood. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Deb Flashenberg, and I'm your host of Yoga Birth Babies, and I have such a treat for you with today's podcast. We talk all about movement during labor, the benefits of it. We go into pelvic shape and sizes, getting the peanut ball out, how to move effectively with an epidural, the importance of movement during labor and pushing. It is absolutely my jam. I loved this conversation. So for this conversation, I have Brittany Sharpe McCollum. Let me tell you a little bit about Brittany. She is a perinatal pelvic biomechanics educator, a labor support doula, childbirth educator, and owner of Blossoming Bellies Holistic Birth Services based out of the greater Philadelphia area. She knows so much. We talk about how the pelvis opens from the top to the mid to the bottom to the sacrum, how to advocate for movement during labor and birth in a hospital setting, because sometimes you get kind of set in a position and then kind of left there, and the importance of helping baby navigate its way through the pelvis. I absolutely loved everything about this conversation, but most importantly, I feel like you, the listener, will gather so much knowledge and confidence in your body's ability to birth your baby and bringing your team on board to help you with that. So I'm really, really excited for you to hear Brittany talk. Before we get to that, I always love to give an update about the studio, about Prenatal Yoga Center. We just celebrated our 22nd birthday. We had a little online birthday party. It was super fun. And so we're moving ahead. We're still going. I actually just signed another 5-year lease. And we still have our classes online 7 days a week, in studio 6 days a week, a whole plethora of workshops to support you throughout pregnancy, birth, and early parenthood. And then, of course, we've got our teacher training. We just jumped into our early fall with our September, October cohort. And then we do that 3 times a year online, and then we do it once a year in person. So our March, April will be in person in New York City, a great reason to come to New York. And then we have our postnatal teacher training in May. So much happening at PYC. It's really, really exciting. You can check all that out on our website at prenatalYogaCenter.com. And then, as always, I love to give a big thank you to you, the listener, who's part of our community. Even if we're not taking class face-to-face or online, you're still part of PYC. You're still what makes us function and move forward. So thank you for that. Now, I have a request of you, my dear listener friend. If you can leave a rating and review for the podcast, it will help people find us, because our whole purpose is to support the community. So thank you for helping support us. All right, that is enough of me. We're going to take a super quick break. And when we come back, please enjoy my conversation with Brittany.
Your teen requested a ride, but this time not from you. It's through their Uber teen account. You drive your teenager around, a lot, to their friend Jacob's house, their other friend Jake's house, to James's, to Jaden's, to Jalen's, to...
Mom? This is Jake's house, not Jacob's.
Now with an Uber teen account, your teen can request a ride under your supervision. They'll ride with a highly rated driver, and with live trip tracking, you'll follow along the whole ride to their friends' houses that all sound the same. Add your teen to your Uber account today. See app for details.
Bye, Mom.
Hi, Brittany. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to jump in. I love talking about birth. I love talking about the physiology of birth and the pelvis. So I'm
Yes.
giddy to get into this conversation. But before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of birth and movement and labor, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and how did you get into birth work?
Sure. So, my oldest son is about to turn 18, which is a whole different topic, but that's crazy to me because I still feel like he's a little baby in my arms. But anyway, um, let's see. So his birth is kind of what pushed me into doing this work. I went into my birth experience feeling really excited and really confident and just feeling like people have been giving birth forever and like just kind of like really just feeling like there was all this innate wisdom that was going to guide me through the process. And what I did not realize until really, really late in my pregnancy was that my providers were really not aligned with me in terms of how they were expecting things to
That's
go
a
in my
whole
birth.
nother podcast conversation itself,
Right?
too. Whoa.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yes, totally. So I went through most of my pregnancy just with this kind of blind confidence, and then realized really late in the game, like, oh, wow, there are so many questions I should have been asking along the way. I should have followed my gut when it came to like things that happened during prenatal visits that I didn't feel 100% comfortable with. And I went into my birth feeling the exact same way, feeling kind of on edge and anxious about how things were going to unfold, about the type of support that I had there with me. And I came out of my birth feeling the same way, feeling like, oh my gosh, like what the heck happened? I I just felt really like it was not the empowering experience I expected, and I felt like I really had to kind of like fight my way through what I wanted the entire time, which left me feeling really discouraged.
Mm.
So after having my son, I started diving into birth and just trying to learn a lot more about the maternity culture in this country primarily. And the more I learned about the reproductive healthcare system, the more I was like, oh my goodness, people need to know their options, and they need to know how to communicate. They need to know what the system is expecting from them, and how to navigate that with skills. And the more I kind of again like continue to learn about birth and all of that, I just was like, I want to teach this to people. I want to share with people what their options are. And so I started certifying as an educator, and then soon after that, certified as a doula. And by the time my son was 10 months old, I was starting to teach my first childbirth classes and had my first doula clients lined up. So it's been over 17 years now of doing this work. And I have 4 kids now. So my last 3 births were way more empowering. And I think that just had a lot to do with me knowing what I wanted and how to make sure I got what I wanted out of my birth. And each of those experiences got better and better, which is also really cool to be able to talk to people about how healing subsequent births can be when you have had a scenario that felt traumatic the first time around.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry that your first birth was traumatic. But
Yeah.
it did sound like, I'm going to silver line this. You can tell me to shut up. But it
Yeah,
did
no.
sound like it kind of catapulted you into a whole new direction.
Absolutely. And that's what I always tell my son too. I don't think he really thinks so much about he's not upset that I felt like my birth was traumatic, but I tell him all the time, like, if I hadn't had that experience with you, I probably would have thought like, of course people can have exactly the birth that they want. And I probably would not have been pushed into doing this work in the same way. So at this point, after years and years of doing this, I can look back on that experience and be like, it was actually amazing because it was the catalyst for everything that came after. But in the moment, it felt like a lot of stuff to emotionally sort through.
Yeah, my first birth was long, 42 hours. And
Ooh.
I later thought, I'm like, it was my pelvic floor. It was my psoas. They were tight. I was cycling like a crazy person. And it was that experience that made me step back and be like, let's take a closer look at what we're doing during pregnancy and how that's impacting birth.
Right.
So how did you get into the physiology of movement from your doula work? Was it watching dysfunctional, that's a horrible name, births that were not flowing well that made you step back and be like, okay, what's going on inside?
It was a little bit of that, a little bit of like trying to kind of tie in my own experience to what I was learning about birth. So I started really diving deep into the pelvis when I was pregnant with my second, which was 6 years after my first. And so in those first 6 years of doing birth work, I attended a lot of births as a doula. And I started seeing interesting things happening where sometimes people would have these really straightforward, kind of very, very, for lack of a better word, like kind of, yes, exactly. I was going to say simple, but that was not the word. Efficient, efficient births. And then I would see other people have these really long, challenging experiences. And a lot of times, many of the circumstances seem to be similar, yet the situation or scenario, the way it played out was really different. And so that was like really interesting to me. And just in trying to better support my clients, I tried to learn more about like baby positioning and more about the pelvis. And as I started down the rabbit holes of those topics, I was like, oh my goodness. So as I was learning more about baby positioning, it kind of like automatically pushed me into learning more about the pelvis. And then I was learning about like a lot of conflicting things about the pelvis. Like I would read about one thing and then I would like read research about something that totally contradicted what was kind of just laid out as truth. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. So the more I dove into learning about the pelvis specifically, the more again, I was like, people need to know about this. So I started, when I was pregnant with my second, I started teaching just real short 2-hour workshops to doulas specifically, all about incorporating effective movement into birth. Like what are some of the positions that tend to work well in different scenarios? And then that workshop evolved from there. I was teaching it like a 2-hour workshop out of my house, and it evolved to this 9-hour workshop now that is approved by the PA Board of Nursing for contact hours for nurses. And it's just, it kind of took off from there. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, this is so what I personally love talking about the pelvis, the pelvic floor, the psoas, the soft tissue, the baby position, because I don't do birth work anymore, but I was a doula for a little over 10 years. And I was fascinated by the same thing. I'm like, why are certain births that baby's just flying out and then other births? And I started to see certain similarities between habits and choices. And I put myself in there. Like, as I mentioned, I was literally in my spin clothes. I'm like, if my contractions go away, I can hit the 10 o'clock class. And then in hindsight, I'm like, do we think that was a problem? And then I also was like, why didn't anyone tell me? So I love this stuff. It really is what excites me. So I'm really excited to get into it. So let's talk a little bit about your thoughts about pelvis shape and size, because I can't tell you how many times I've had students or I've been at a birth. I remember still one birth. It still scares me because it was my friend. She was at my wedding. I remember her. I was her doula, and she was literally pushing, and the doctor's like, your pelvis is just too small. Like it's like broke my heart, because how do you have confidence at that point and she was going for a VBAC, if your doctor is saying it's not going to work, so she had another cesarean, but she honestly felt good about it because she said, my doctor said my pelvis was too small, so this is the right thing. I was not about to be like, we could have tried other positions. But anyway, that's not the point. But I would love to hear your thoughts about pelvic size and shape.
Yes. Okay. So this is one of those topics that I cover really in depth in those workshops that I teach. So I love talking about this. So first, let's just be clear about what the research says. The research says that there is significant variation from one person's pelvis to the next, whether people are from the same or different geographical regions around the world. So with the research telling us there's significant variation within pelvises, that's really important for us to start with. Like we don't all just have like one specific pelvic shape and that's it. And in fact, the old school model of pelvic shape classification, the Caldwell-Malloy theory, said that there were 4 basic pelvic shapes, which people from around the world all had one of these 4 basic shapes. And that's actually been totally refuted by obstetrical and anthropological research. So we know that there's significant variation from one pelvis to the next. When it comes to assessing somebody's pelvic shape, many providers do attempt to do some sort of manual pelvimetry where with an internal exam, they try to assess the space available in the pelvis. And what research tells us about that is that it is not an accurate indicator as to whether or not somebody can have a vaginal birth. The results from manual pelvimetry do not dictate whether somebody is able to have a vaginal birth or not. So knowing that, it kind of makes manual pelvimetry almost seem really like a moot point. But it is something that a lot of providers still do with internal exams to help them better understand whether or not there may be enough quote unquote room for the baby. The problem though, well, there's lots of problems, but some of the main problems with manual pelvimetry are that number one, the position that people are in when manual pelvimetry is done is typically a position that closes off the pelvic outlet as much as possible. So we're literally putting people into a position that creates the smallest amount of space possible, and then using that to maybe, like you said in the story you shared, to determine whether or not somebody is likely to have a vaginal
So
birth.
describe that position.
Yeah.
Because that's likely the position that many people are birthing with, which you just said makes the smallest space, because we're literally eliminating possibility of movement like through the sacrum.
Yep, exactly. So typically the common internal exam position is somebody lays on their back, either fully reclined or mostly reclined, and the soles of their feet come together, and their legs are bent at the knees, so the knees are opened out. So that puts the thighs into external rotation, which creates less space side to side at the bottom of the pelvis. And then in addition to that, with somebody being on their back, the sacrum has no ability to move or shift out of the way. So we're getting minimal side to side space and minimal front to back space. Now that's not all that's being assessed. The pubic arch, the degree of the pubic arch is being assessed. But even in that situation, if we change the position, we can widen the pubic arch. We can widen the space between the sits bones there at the base of the pubic arch. We can allow the sacrum to open significantly to create more space front to back. So we're feeling a stagnant pelvic space at its smallest, and using that to potentially determine how likely somebody is to have a vaginal birth when manual pelvimetry is done. And then the second part of it too that isn't taken into consideration with manual pelvimetry is that the bones of the baby's head mold. So it's not like the baby's head is just coming out in this super round, kind of sphere. The baby's head is molding. And so of course, if we have a baby with a larger head, that baby is likely going to require a little more time for molding. So maybe we won't see pushing times that are the same as somebody whose baby has a smaller head. But the bones of the skull literally overlap. Babies come out with a quote unquote cone head, and that allows them to maneuver their way down through that pelvic space. I'm sure you're going to ask me about this later on, but I'll just give a little teaser with it right now. One of the most important things for giving the baby that wiggle room during pushing is frequency of changing position. And most people, not only are they in a position that creates as little space as possible at the bottom of the pelvis when they're pushing, but they also are usually staying in that position for the entire time that they're pushing. So it's not even like they're shifting that space very much at all in many circumstances. So that's problematic too.
Yeah, I definitely am about to follow up on the question about movement. But I remember a student, so we teach childbirth education at Prenatal Yoga Center. We have some handouts, and it's all these different pushing positions. And there's probably, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 different positions. And one of my students came back after she had her baby. She said she brought it with her to the hospital because she's like, I'm not going to remember. My husband's not going to remember. So she called it her cheat sheet. And she laughed. Yes. She's like, we put such effort into packing everything. We had our cheat sheet. She's like, I stayed in one position the whole time. There was no other. And I'm like, I'm not surprised. Like they didn't even let her go on her side. Like, but she was like ready. Goodness. She's like, I might get on all fours. I might try to squat. I might try to do the tug of war. I might knees together, feet around. She's like, I stayed in one position the whole time. She's on her back. Knees to armpits, toes out, chin to chest. And I'm like, yeah. But I love that she thought of trying, but it just wasn't facilitated. So let's talk about the importance. I'm going to back up before the pushing stage and talk about the importance of movement during labor, because we got to get that baby through the pelvis towards the outlet before we start pushing. So let's go about, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the benefit of movement during labor.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like you said, I mean, the baby has to come through the upper and middle portions of the pelvis first before you even get to pushing. So we need to incorporate movement throughout the entire labor process. The one thing that comes up a lot when I teach childbirth education is people usually come to class maybe having done some sort of reading or something, and they are like, well, I read that I'm supposed to rest in early labor. And that is so true. I am a huge proponent of resting in early labor. And in fact, I tell people, like, rest until you can't rest anymore when you're in labor. But we can't forget that it's still super important to move. And that's why it's important to understand how pelvic space changes, because when we know how pelvic space changes, we can realize that actually movement can be really simple and subtle, but still super effective. So I love to tell people that throughout their entire labor process, from start to finish, they should ideally be moving every 5 contractions or so. And now some people are like, oh my gosh, that sounds crazy. And on the surface, yes, that sounds crazy. But when we talk about frequency of movement, we're talking about it based on the number of contractions. So if somebody's in early labor, moving every 5 contractions might be doing something different every 45 minutes. And that might seem a lot more doable. And when I say do something different, I'm not saying like get into all fours and then get into a squat and then, lie on your side and then do all fours. Again, like I'm saying, let's change up our thigh rotation. That's one way that we change pelvic space. Let's shift how our sacrum is positioned. Is it sticking out or is it tucking in? And let's do something asymmetrical. And just to give an example, if somebody was resting, let's say they're side lying through early labor, trying to maybe get a little sleep, they're laying in their bed, they could have their bottom leg stretched out and their top leg pulled up towards their chest, resting onto a pillow in front of their belly. Or they could have both legs pulled up towards their chest in a quote unquote fetal position. Those would be 2 different movements or positions. So I'm saying literally like alter how your thighs are positioned every 5 contractions, which isn't super crazy. But then of course, as things progress into labor and contractions are stronger and longer, and we're getting that feedback from all the pressure from the baby's head on the cervix, we're getting these stronger contractions. Now it's probably not going to be super comfortable to lie down through these contractions. People are going to have to get up and move. And so then we want to start incorporating more big dramatic movements if possible. So this might be the time where we might spend a few contractions climbing the stairs and then go back into a resting position or something like that. But still remembering every 5 contractions, let's do something different. Let's change our thigh rotation, change our sacral position, and or create asymmetry. And I would continue to use that guideline throughout the entire labor process. And I also want to point out, although I didn't mention this yet, movement is something that can be done with an epidural too. That's a huge misconception
yes,
out there.
I definitely want. Let's actually jump there.
Yeah, sure.
It's a question
let's do it.
way down on my little list, but let's jump there because we talk a lot about this in prenatal yoga about like positions and just like you said, different thigh rotations will open different parts of the pelvis. And I've had students almost like sheepishly come over like, well, I'm going to have an epidural. I'm like, most people are. So no reason, don't feel shy about it. And she's like, so how am I going to do different positions? So let's talk about epidurals and movement.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people feel like they can't move or support people don't know how to help. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how different positions with an epidural, maybe props, a no peanut ball, something, and then how the partners can help with that. Because I know these little nuances can make a huge difference.
Oh gosh. Yes. And I always talk about this when I first start talking about movement in birth class. I always say movement is something that can be done with or without pain medication. Let's just set that up from the start. Let's have the expectation be that we are going to encourage and support and facilitate movement throughout the entire process, no matter what.
Yeah, now, the people just get left there. Like they get their epidural and then they're left there. And then they're like, been here for 2 hours and why is my baby now not in a great position?
Right. Yes. And it's a bad thing about our current reproductive healthcare system because nurses they're not working with only one person at a time.
They're so taxed.
Right. And so it's hard for them to come into the room frequently. It's hard for them to be in there to facilitate movement. And so people really have to be able to know on their own what to do. Or I always like to say, nurses can have really simple techniques that they can show partners, and then partners can do it when the nurse isn't able to be in the room. And I'll share what some of those are too. I don't want to leave anyone hanging. Okay, so if somebody has an epidural, typically a nurse comes in about once every hour or so to turn them from one side to the next or change their position or something like that. Now, like we said, sometimes nurses can't come in every hour. And so it might even be 2 or 3 hours that sometimes people are just kind of left to, hang out by themselves in the laboring room. I think if people don't realize that there's going to be long periods of time where they're by themselves in the space. Of course, if somebody has an epidural, we think of someone lying in bed, and that's one option, to be lying down. But epidurals, they block sensory nerve impulses to the brain, but they don't block all the motor nerve impulses to the brain. So even though somebody can't feel, generally from roughly the rib cage down, they still can often move their body, far more often than not, actually. But it's a weird thing because if you can't feel your body and you've never seen somebody move with an epidural, then you have this idea that you can't. And if nobody no clinical provider is telling you can move, most people aren't even going to attempt to do any sort of movement.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to first off know that movement is possible with an epidural, even if you can't feel your lower half. So side lying offers a lot of opportunity for movement because we can use props, like you said, like the peanut ball in between the thighs. And I'll share a little peanut ball trick in a minute, but we can put the peanut ball between the thighs. We could put the peanut ball next to the thighs and drape the top leg over top. We could put the peanut ball between the ankles. So it offers just right there 3 different ways to change space in the pelvis by using the peanut ball in different ways. And then we could do that whole series of 3 movements on the other side of the body. But it's also important to point out that with an epidural, most people can get into an all fours position on the bed. Or one of my favorites with an epidural, they can kneel on the bed and lean over the back of the bed, raising the bed so it's almost into a throne position, and then they lean over the back. And I've worked with some really amazing nurses that have a lot of confidence in movement with an epidural, and that's usually one of their go-to positions. Is let's use gravity, and let's free up the sacrum, and let's have people lean over the back of the bed. So if you have an amazing nurse, that's probably something that's already in their toolkit. But that's an option that offers a lot of opportunity for pelvic space change because people can stagger the legs. They could externally rotate their thighs. They could internally rotate their thighs. They could have a folded pillow under one knee and then a folded pillow under the other knee. They could, with support, rock their hips side to side. They might be able to round and arch their lower back. So it offers a lot of opportunity to move. And all of that can be done with an epidural most of the time, or of course without an epidural too. And then seated positions as well, sitting in the bed with the back of the bed raised up. People could sit with their legs open, kind of like a butterfly position. They could bring their knees together so that their ankles are out. They could stretch one leg out and have the other leg bent, kind of like a figure 4 position. And then they could do the same thing on the other side. They could prop a peanut ball under one leg so they have some elevation on one side and not on the other. So all those options create subtle changes of space that are going to help the baby to navigate their way down and out. So all of that's possible with an epidural. The only things that I usually say are really not possible with an epidural would be standing, getting out of the bed, standing, and then sitting on the birth ball. Those would not be options. But still, many options available.
And I'm so glad you highlighted that because I do think people are like, oh, I have the epidural, now I'm kind of stuck. But these little things, because one thing we haven't broken down, and then we're going to have to take a break after this, but one thing we haven't broken down is you and I both mentioned internal, external, asynclitic. Yeah. Can you break down, just so people in their mind can understand the journey from the inlet to the mid pelvis to the outlet, and how the femur bone and how an asymmetrical position can add more space? Is that making sense, the question?
Absolutely. Okay. And absolutely. So when we think about the thighs, let's say we're seated in a chair, and if anyone's listening and able to do this now, you can follow along with me because it sometimes it's helpful to feel it in your own body. If you're seated in a chair, your feet could be directly below your knees could be directly in line with your hips. So you have all these kind of neutral angles there. But if you tilt your thighs outward so that they're moving away from the midline of your body, you're creating external thigh rotation. So your knees are coming out, and your thighs are externally rotating. And the femur, which is the thigh bone, enters into the hips at the true pelvis. And so when the thighs go into external rotation, there's pressure in at the hips that actually closes off the bottom of the pelvis side to side, but opens the top of the pelvis side to side.
Like a clothespin.
Exactly. The pelvis is like a clothespin. If you squeeze one end, the other end's going to open. Exactly. So for a baby that's higher up at the inlet, having the thighs in external rotation gives them wiggle room at the inlet. And if we did the opposite, so if we're seated and we bring our thighs towards each other, you might need to have your ankles out a little more to do that comfortably. But now your thighs are tilting towards the midline of your body. Think of them coming together towards like your belly button area, like not coming up, but coming in. Now we have internal thigh rotation, and that opens space at the bottom of the pelvis and closes space at the top of the pelvis. So the way we rotate our thighs has an impact on side to side space. But we could also do something on just one side of the body. So if we had our left leg neutral and we took our right leg and we put the thigh into external rotation, now we've opened the right top of the pelvis while the other side has stayed neutral. So that would be an asymmetrical position. And asymmetrical positions are great for asynclitic babies, which is a whole other can of worms. But Asynclitic babies are babies who have their heads tilted to one side or the other. And sometimes they'll also extend their head, meaning lift their chin off their chest, and they can get themselves into some really funky positions in there. But for positions where babies' heads are tilted, which you may or may not know in labor, but asymmetrical positions work really well, which is why, we don't always know how our babies are positioned. And even when a provider does an internal exam, they actually can't always tell accurately how a baby is positioned.
Yeah, it depends on how much the cervix is open, if they can feel the little sutures in the back of their head. So, and some care providers have more experience with that than others.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I always tell people too, if your baby's in a really funky position in there, they probably can't figure it out at all because they're not going to be able to feel those suture lines whatsoever.
Because they're getting like side of the head, if the ear is to the shoulder, like, what am I feeling there? All right, we've got to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to keep going into movements during labor. I have a couple multi-layer questions because this is so my jam. I'm loving this. Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Batiste Dry Shampoo. Whether you're on the go, at the gym, or getting ready for a night out, Batiste has a dry shampoo for you. Refresh with over 10 signature fragrances. Or try Batiste Hint of Color, a tinted dry shampoo that seamlessly blends with your hair. Need an extra boost? Try Batiste Dry Shampoo with added benefits like volumizing, texturizing, and more. Buy Batiste now, in-store or online at your nearest retailer.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By honoring your sacred vocation of education, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. At Grand Canyon University, our online bachelor's, master's, and doctoral education degree programs allow you to balance online coursework with observational and hands-on experience in the field. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Okay, we are back. So let's talk a little bit more about the physiology of movement during labor because we know it really can create so much space for babies. So when it comes to labor, how might our bodies guide us to follow instinctual movements? Because I feel like if you tell someone, oh, just move how you think you should, they're going to overthink, like, I don't know how I'm supposed to move. So how do you help? Can I even say that in yoga? Like, it's one of my least favorite things, like, do what feels right. And people are like, I don't know what feels right. And so they have to have that. They have to start to have body literacy and learning how to listen to their body. So how can people find the confidence to listen to their instincts when they may feel like, I don't know what my instincts are. And then there might be the idea of like, connect to your instincts versus social conditioning of, oh, this is what I should look like. I know, I just opened a lot. So there you go.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So many things. Like my brain is like filled with things right now that I want to say. Okay. So first let's talk about like innate wisdom or, confidence, intuition, so forth. So I think that people do many times know how to move. Their body is giving them some sort of like guidance in terms of what to do. But whether our thinking brains are able to take on that message is a whole different thing. So as humans, we have these big thinking brains, which are exactly what you were just pointing out, like that part of our brain that says to us, like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to listen to my body. Like this is crazy. This one feels more intense than the last one. Or how long am I going to have to do this? Or this position that I want to get into seems totally crazy. There's no way we can comfortably do this. That's all of our thinking brain kind of overreacting in labor. And so we need to be able to turn our thinking brains off to the best of our ability. I like to say we try to disengage our thinking brains. And that's like all well and good, except if you just plan to do that in the moment, it can be really, really hard. So although I do not believe that people need to train for birth, I do think that it's helpful to maybe kind of give our thinking brains a little bit of extra attention in late pregnancy, meaning let's try out some common positions that are beneficial in labor, some positions that we may not get into on a daily basis. Let's get comfortable with them. Let's create some familiarity with them in late pregnancy so that then in labor, when our support person or our doula or our cheat sheet of labor positions tells us to give this a try, our thinking brains are already like, oh yeah, this is something we already know about. We're familiar
Yes,
with
that
it.
is what I say to the students all the time. Like, we are
Yes, so
just
important.
feeling, if you're comfortable on the mat, you do it enough, you're familiar, it is going to feel instinctual during birth. You're not going to be like, what is that cat cow thing? What is this hip thing? Like, they've done it. It's in their their body vocabulary.
Yes, totally. Like one of my favorite positions, and I'll share one that's my favorite, whether people have an epidural or not, is in kneeling, like all fours position, but with the leg kind of hiked up into a lunge.
Mm-hmm.
That's a favorite of mine. And I've found that many people, I would even go so far as to say most people with an epidural can do that leaning over the back of the bed. So it's a position that can be used in almost all labor experiences. But if you've never done that position before, especially if it's your first baby, like you have a toddler at home, like you probably sit on the floor, you probably do all sorts of weird things with your toddler that you never did before. But if it's your first baby, you might not be spending a whole lot of time on the floor. And so a position that's not only kneeling or all fours position, but also with your leg in a lunge is probably something that the average person is not super familiar with. So even though in labor, that's an amazing position, they probably would never even think to do that in labor if it wasn't something that was already in their wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And if they did it once in birth class or once in prenatal yoga and then never did it again, also, it's not going to be something that they're familiar with. And it's going to make their thinking brain go into panic mode. Like, this is weird. This is different. And that does not benefit the labor process. Repetition, exactly. So at the end of pregnancy, try a couple new positions every day or every other day. Think about how they feel in your body. Talk about them with your birth partner so that that person also knows what they can suggest to you throughout labor, what you're already familiar with. And that way you're better prepared to be able to tap into those instincts in labor without your thinking brain going into overdrive.
That is great. So let's talk about the social conditioning where someone may feel like, this is what I've been told I should do, or these are the pictures I've seen on Instagram. How can they get out of what they think? Even when it came to like my student who's like, I know I had other options, but this is what they had me do. So there's that kind of pressure or idea of quote unquote doing it right versus my body's really telling me I need to straddle the toilet. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, maybe. No, that's great. So first of all, I feel like so many of us get our information about birth from movies and TV shows, which those images of birth are very sensationalized, meant to sell advertising. Right. Always. And the water always breaks first and it's like flood and it's crazy. Yeah. So it sells advertising. It keeps people on the edge of their seats. It keeps that like attention on the screen. And so if that's all of what we're seeing about birth, we start to believe that birth is really chaotic most of the time. And also that it happens so fast. You know, the first contraction you have, you better get to your birthing place, which as we know, you shared your 42-hour labor. That's not usually the case. It's not usually the case that your first contraction means it's time to head to your birthing place. So we have to realize that images of birth in TV shows and movies are just not accurate. And so I was going to go off on a tangent, but I'm not. So that's one part of it. But then we also have to realize that the average obstetrical provider or even the average hospital-based midwife, the average labor and delivery nurse has not had training in biomechanics. So they are trained to visualize the baby coming out, specifically during pushing. They're not trained in how the pelvic bones open or close or the impact of soft tissue on pelvic space. And so they're prioritizing seeing what's happening during pushing. So that means that for them to be able to see easily, it makes sense for people to be on their back with their legs open. And, with epidurals from the when they first became really popular in the 1970s, 1980s, epidurals they were super heavy. They did prevent a lot of movement. So we kind of are stuck in this way of thinking about the pushing, especially the pushing phase of labor, with this idea of like heavy epidurals and inability to move and needing to watch the baby come out. And nothing has really changed in the past 50 plus years. And so a lot of providers really do emphasize being able to watch what's happening as the baby descends. And even if you can't see the baby yet during pushing, they're still watching for the changes in the vulva. And rather than prioritizing what might be physiologically beneficial or what might be more comfortable for the person laboring, their emphasis tends to be on, again, trying to see what's happening, which means they then say, this is the pushing position. Let's get you on your back. And if we don't have the, first of all, knowledge of the benefits of movement, which I know you asked me about, and I did not even answer that question, which I can get into that. But if we don't have the knowledge of why movement is so beneficial, if we don't have a kind of, again, like body familiarity with different positions, and if we don't have a support team around us that is reminding us of the benefits of movement and helping to facilitate positioning changes for us, then we wind up in a situation where the person who ideally should have the most power in the room, the person laboring, winds up being in this really vulnerable state with everyone around them telling them something that goes against their instincts. And at that point, they have to really choose, like, am I going to focus on trying to get this baby out, or am I going to focus on debating what I want to do with the people around me? And it's hard, like, it's hard to be able to devote energy to pushing out a baby when you also have to devote energy to advocating for yourself. So having a great doula by your side, having a partner who understands the importance of movement, those are people that can really help, even in a situation where a provider may not be super familiar with or supportive of movement. They can help to remind you, like, hey, we tried out a few different pushing positions. After a few in this position, let's try something different, or let's try all fours. And so that can be really helpful, because the reality is that even when you have all that information on your own, it's really hard to implement that effectively when you're in labor, because your body is just working so hard and so single-mindedly on getting this baby out.
Yeah, and the brain shouldn't be in that state, because it's going to pull you more into that frontal cortex, and it's just going to, it's not where labor needs to be. But I really like what you talked about, like the advocating for the person birthing. And there often is restrictive movement in a hospital setting. And as a doula for years, I saw that. And sometimes I will admit that I did my third birth when I was a brand new doula. I was still getting my certification. I had a client that was on all fours, and it wasn't her doctor, it was a resident who's like, I will absolutely not birth you that way. Because I actually, in hindsight, I'm like, she didn't know what to do otherwise.
Right.
And I realized again, like years later, I'm like, oh, that's the case.
That's
but
why.
I was so new. I did not know how to advocate for her to be like, no, we're going to stay here. And she flipped over and she pushed out, her baby was 10 pounds.
Wow.
And she was my size, like 5'2". And she pushed that baby out so quickly, she tore so badly, but I was believed it was out of spite. She pushed that baby out. And there can be somewhat rigid sometimes rules in hospitals. And I really think it comes from not understanding, which is crazy because they're care providers, they're physicians for the most part, but not understand the physiology and the movement of the pelvis. And I think that's to the detriment of the person birthing.
Absolutely. And with such high epidurals, and there's nothing wrong with getting an epidural, because as we talked about, you can move with an epidural, but with such high epidural rates and so many people not realizing that movement is a possibility, most providers have very, very little experience with any position other than being on the back during pushing, especially. Most hospital providers have not seen many, if any, unmedicated births. And then with high epidural rates and people not knowing that they can move, nobody is like helping to facilitate that movement. We lack that one-on-one care like we talked about earlier. And so people just kind of wind up in this situation where both the person birthing doesn't know what's possible, and even a provider doesn't know what's possible. I mean, they have, of course, their skill set is very different. And like, if you need to have a cesarean birth, we love that skill set that they have. But when it comes to just effective, simple, research-based ways to improve birth outcomes, like changing position, that's just not something that has ever been the emphasis of the hospital model of care, because of such high levels of pain management, like medical pain relief. So
I feel like in the New York area, we have a small handful of doctors who are very open to different positions, side, kneeling. Back when I was practicing, I had one doctor, she was on the floor and the client was standing and she was pushing. It was fantastic, but I feel like it's few and far between, but we do have like a small special group. And I wish that was more the case, because we'll kind of circle it back about the importance of movement. And we can talk about the importance of movement during the pushing and as you did allude to it, like what happens with the sacrum if you're on your back. I think of like a trap door or like, those suitcases that if you unzip it, like you pop up more space.
Right. Right. Oh my God. I love that analogy. Yes.
So like if you're on your sacrum, like you have it zipped, like if you get off your sacrum, suddenly you have like a whole bunch more space.
Absolutely. And the thing is too, if the sacrum's just free to move, then the baby will push the sacrum out of the way as they come lower. So you could specifically do positions that kind of arch the lower back and lift the sacrum even more, but you don't even have to. As long as the sacrum is free to move, the baby's going to help move it out of the way. And it's not that being on the back is bad, although it's not great, but people like that position because they can rest, and that's great, but it's great for a few contractions. Let's not do that same thing for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Like I was saying before, anything, even if it's the best position in the world, and that's tongue in cheek, I'm saying that 5 contractions, and then it's time to do something different because the baby needs changes of space in order to keep moving down. If the pelvis is stagnant and the uterus is doing this work to push the baby down, but the baby has nothing new to work with, then they have nowhere to go. And it's really unfortunate when people have labored all through the process and they get to pushing and they push for 3 hours and then they have a cesarean because the baby wasn't coming down. And so we can help to prevent that. Of course, we can't prevent every cesarean, but we can help to prevent that scenario by incorporating more frequent position changes. And even something as simple as side lying allows that sacrum to be free. So that's just such a simple adjustment. And like you said before, not every provider is familiar or comfortable with that, but it's actually people's legal right to give birth in whatever position they choose. So they can just be adamant about it in the moment and make sure their support people are adamant about it. But at the same time, it's nice to say that here, sitting here, but in reality, it's a very hard thing to do. So when it comes to advocacy, I usually tell people, let's start at prenatal visits. Let's start asking these questions. Yep. Talking with providers about what they're familiar with and not saying something like, will you let me be in all fours? But instead, how often do you support people in all fours when they're pushing? So that we have an open-ended question so that we can have a conversation prenatally rather than a provider just being like, oh, all the time or not at all, which both of those responses are always red flags in my mind, like always or never. I'm kind of always like, that's not an honest answer. So yeah. I prefer open-ended questions. And then when it comes to advocating in the moment, I actually always tell, especially birth partners, you want to advocate one step ahead. So before they're at the pushing part of labor, that's when we want to say, just wanted to remind you, we're going to be changing position a lot during pushing. So that it's not something in the moment that all of a sudden you're having to like strongly advocate for and having this debate at like the worst time possible.
I like that I want to just highlight what you're talking about, like the support person can really be there for that. Because that's why they're there, so that the person birthing is not thinking one step ahead. They're in the moment. Yes. They're working with their body, their breath, their baby. But the support person can be the person like, fifth contraction. Let's try this. Or, we were talking about pushing in a different position. They can really help keep birth flowing and really help baby find that favorable position. All right. 100%. I have one more question before I start to kind of shift things. Okay. Let's talk about posterior or asynclitic babies. What are some? I know, because I had one, and so my heart's out to those, and I've supported those with posterior, and it's tough. Those are tough births. Yeah. So I guess the first thing is, what are some red flags that you'd be like, okay, let's really consider what's going on with this baby's position, and some tips for readjusting baby.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a soft spot for posterior babies because I think they're very misunderstood. A lot of times when people's babies are posterior, the focus is on let's get them to spin to the front, spin to the front, spin to the front. And so it's a lot of like all fours, all fours, all fours. And in some scenarios, I have found, and this is very anecdotal because our research on positioning, specific nuanced positioning with posterior babies is completely lacking. So this is very anecdotal. But I think I've had also a lot of, for lack of better words, like success with some of these techniques. So we have this emphasis on like somebody's baby's posterior, get them into all fours. But the thing is, if it's a first baby, especially, that baby is likely to be positioned, if they're posterior, likely to be positioned with the back of their head along the back right side of the laboring person's body. And although it would make sense from our like thinking brain standpoint that they would take the shortest way around, they might kind of spin to the front along the right side. In reality, the way that the uterus tilts and the way that the uterus contracts encourages babies, and this is research based, more often than not, it encourages babies to rotate clockwise, which means that the posterior baby is likely to take the long way around. They're actually going to come around to the back and then to the left side in order to make their way down and out. And sometimes we don't even realize the baby's posterior and they just like work their way down and out with no problems. And then other times we have this long drawn out labor with a funky contraction pattern. And those are some characteristics that I always feel like if somebody's having a lot of what we would call like prodromal labor, contractions that are kind of like random and all over the place, but uncomfortable. There's no set pattern or progression to them, though. That's always to me like, that baby's trying to figure something out in there. Or if they are, well, let me also say that could also be a sign of dehydration. So making sure someone's hydrated is also important. But if somebody has a really funky contraction pattern, like coupling of contractions, where there's like 2 strong contractions and then a break, and then 2 strong contractions and a break, or they have a contraction pattern where the contractions are very short but very close, consistent, like 30 seconds long but 3 minutes apart, and that can fool people into thinking they're in active labor. But that's not an active labor pattern for most people. So weird contraction patterns signal to me that something's going on in there. Either baby might be posterior or asynclitic. And sometimes posterior babies will cause back discomfort. I would say in my experience, most of the time they do. But sometimes people have back discomfort and their baby's not posterior. So we have to make sure we recognize that back labor may not always be a sign that the baby is posterior. So we also want to pay attention to what the contraction pattern is. So that, all of that being said,
can I throw one more in there?
Please do.
One more red flag. I learned this at, I think, the 5th birth. I've done over 100, but some of them scarred me. The 5th birth was my first posterior birth. And with every contraction, she'd feel like she had to pee. So I called my mentor and she's like, oh my God, that's a posterior baby, because the forehead was pressing against the bladder. And that stuck with me. Yeah, it's great to have a mentor to call when you're like, what do I do?
Absolutely. I love that you brought that up. And that also raises another kind of characteristic to me as well that I didn't mention, early rectal pressure. That can be another sign. So with the bladder pressure, that could be a baby who's posterior and their head likely is not extended yet. But if we have a lot of rectal pressure prior to being 6 centimeters dilated, that could signal, and again, like this is very like anecdotal based on experiences, but that could signal that a baby's posterior and starting to extend their head, meaning kind of lift their chin off their chest. And now, like let's try to work through that before that gets more intense, because once that baby really extends their head, now we're working with a baby that's potentially getting wedged in the pelvis. So that need to pee all the time without actually peeing, and then also that like early rectal pressure, those could also be signs that the baby's posterior.
So we've got a good list of red flags. So someone's like, okay, check. I've got this going on. How do they help? What can they do?
Yeah, so I actually usually do not recommend all 4s unless we have some sort of signal that the baby might be rotating counterclockwise, or if the baby's along the left side of the person's body. So I usually tell people, let's do a lot of sitting positions on the birth ball with some really big dramatic hip circles, possibly also with elevation of one leg. So propping a leg up onto a stool while sitting on the birth ball and doing some big hip circles. Another favorite of mine would be like putting one foot up on the steps. Like if you have a staircase at your house, putting it up on the second, or if you could, even the third step. The more dramatic the position, the better. And then rotating the hips in circles. And then also I would suggest, and this is probably going to make some people go, no, but I would also suggest spending some time in semi-reclined positions. And I know that sounds crazy, but when we round the lower back, we allow that sacral promontory and at the top back of the pelvis on the inside. The top back of the pelvis on the inside, we allow it to tilt back. We're not talking about centimeters of space. We're literally talking about a difference of maybe 1 to 2 millimeters. But for a posterior baby who's trying to get past that sacral promontory, that 1 to 2 millimeters could be enough to help them work their way past that point or down a little lower and prevent extension of the head. So
That
those
makes
are things
sense
that
to
I
me.
would suggest.
That makes
Yeah, good.
as I'm
Okay.
working with my own pelvis right now.
Yep, me too. I'm literally doing it as I'm talking.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, I feel that. Okay, I get that.
Yeah. And it's not for an hour, because the thing is, it's not going to be comfortable. This is not a comfortable position, but it's 5 contractions. That's it. It's 5. And we don't have to stay in that in between, do it during the contraction, sit up or stand up, move the body a little bit in between. 5 contractions. There's an end in sight. We can get through 5 contractions. Or even if someone's like, I can't do 5, then do 3. Let's start with what's manageable. Let's do 1 and see how that feels. Let's do 1 contraction and then do something else and then come back to that for 1 contraction. It doesn't have to be like a hard and fast rule. I don't want people to feel like they have like a rule book they need to follow. But I do find that spending just a few contractions in a semi-reclined position can make a huge difference with a posterior baby. So those are some of my favorite go-to moves if I suspect that a baby might be posterior.
And whether someone absorbs all that or not in this moment, the fact that, first, I love every suggestion. The fact, though, that someone might hear this and just say, my baby can move, that they're not like, okay, baby's posterior, wah, wah. Like, that babies can move because the pelvis can move. So I think that's kind of like the big takeaway is like, we're not just stuck with how it starts. Like babies need to move. And that can be kind of go back to what we started earlier. It's not that baby may be too big or baby stuck. Like we can try, and not all the time is it going to work, but there is the possibility of helping that baby find its way. Oh my gosh, I've loved this. Okay, we have to take another break. But when we come back, and I'm so curious because you have 4 kids and you're a doula and a childbirth educator. So I'm really curious how you're going to answer this. What is one, we'll take a quick break first, but what is one final tip or piece of advice you'd like to offer new and expectant parents? Think on that. We're taking a break. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So what hat are you going to pull from?
Oh my goodness. There are so many things that I want to talk about still, and I know we don't have the time to. So I think I'm going to share something that is I literally think when it comes to movement, it is, in addition to the frequency of position changing, literally the most important thing. And that is to move rhythmically with contractions. So many people feel that when a contraction comes on, like they just got to get through it. So they tighten up, they might tense their shoulders, they sit still, and they wait for it to be over. But the uterus, even when we're not pushing, even through the dilation part of labor, the uterus is pushing, or kind of not pushing, we'll say squeezing around the baby. And so the baby is moving down very incrementally, but moving down even during dilation contractions. And if we change that pelvic space by rocking side to side, doing some pelvic tilts front to back, or doing hip circles during contractions, we're giving the baby something new to work with while the uterus is actually moving them slightly downward. So we're making contractions as efficient as possible. This is going to help prevent babies from getting quote unquote stuck in the pelvis. It's also going to help us manage the discomfort of contractions, and it has the potential to shorten the labor process, which is especially nice for first-time parents who tend to have longer labors. So moving rhythmically. But I also want to add in, I know, I'm sorry, because I know that there's a time limit. But I want to add in, like, that sounds like something that can only be done unmedicated, right? But it's not, because, and this goes back to, I promised this earlier, so that's why I want to make sure I add it in. Using the peanut ball, a game-changing thing with the peanut ball is to use it for movement. So if somebody is side-lying and the peanut ball is between their thighs, which is a very common position that a nurse will put somebody in if they have an epidural, the nurse might bring in the peanut ball, put it between their thighs, and have them lie on their side, and then the nurse will say, I'll be back in an hour. So now we have somebody in one position for an hour, potentially in active labor, when they should be changing position every 5 contractions, which means like every 15-20 minutes or so. So now we have this person in a position with the peanut ball in a stagnant position. So this is when the support person, partner, mother, friend, doula, whoever it is that's there supporting them, can literally pull a chair up to the side of the bed and rock the peanut ball. So the person's lying on their side, peanut ball between their thighs, and the support person is just going to rock the peanut ball up and down. And I have a whole bunch of videos of this on my social media. So if people can't actually visualize what I'm saying, you can find it at Blossoming Bellies Birth on Instagram. But this allows for changes in thigh rotation. And if we can do this during a contraction, then we're getting rhythmical movement just like we would in an unmedicated birth. And rocking it is not the only thing. We can also circle it. We could also put the peanut ball in front of the thighs, drape the top leg over, and roll the peanut ball. So those are 3 options for movement with a peanut ball, with an epidural, that can all be done safely when the nurse is not in the room. And then when the nurse comes back in after an hour, that's a great opportunity to say to the nurse, we want to do something different, like kneeling over the back of the bed or turning onto the other side. So we save those bigger movements with an epidural. For the time when the nurse is able to help kind of guide into those positions, but then we can do simple things like rocking and rolling the peanut ball during the contraction so that we get that rhythmical movement, which will help give the baby that space. So whether somebody has an epidural or not, rhythmical movement during contractions is a really, really key thing I have found to create efficiency in labor, prevent the baby from getting into a funky position or from getting wedged in the pelvis, and also, of course, help to manage the discomfort of labor, especially in an unmedicated birth.
Yeah, because it also helps the parasympathetic nervous system. When someone has that rhythmic movement, they're probably breathing in a more rhythmic movement.
Yeah.
And we know that their nervous system is going to react differently. So they all go so beautifully together. I loved that piece of advice. That was so good. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, so my website is blossomingBelliesBirth.com. I have a whole bunch of asynchronous continuing education workshops, many of which are approved for contact hours. I have childbirth classes on there in person in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. And then I also have a whole bunch of self-paced courses for expecting parents. And those obviously can be done anywhere, anytime. So all of that stuff's on my website. I'm on social media as well. Instagram is where I'm most active, but you can also find me on TikTok and Facebook. And Blossoming Bellies Birth is my handle on all of those platforms.
Amazing.
my birth classes are in Philadelphia. And the suburban Philadelphia as well, in the city, and then also just outside the city, and then in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Those are my in-person classes.
Oh, amazing. I'll make sure all of this is on in the show notes. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. I'm grinning. I'm like, I love it.
I wish we could talk for 3 hours.
We probably could. Not on the podcast, but we probably could. So I feel like our brains very much are in sync. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I know the community is going to get so much out of all your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
This has been an episode of Yoga, Birth, Babies, produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope. I'm Deb Flaschenberg. Thanks for listening.
O'Reilly. You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people. O'Reilly.